The morning I accidentally saved a stranger's life, I was running 7 minutes late and my left boot had a hole in it. That detail matters more than it sounds. It was March in Halifax. Which is to say, the slush on Gottingen Street had that particular quality where it looked solid enough to step on, and then swallowed your foot to the ankle. I'd been meaning to replace those boots since November. I just kept not doing it. So by the time I got to the hospital, my sock was soaked through, and I was in the kind of mood that makes you want to snap at anyone who looks at you sideways. I work the breakfast tray run at the QEII. Not a nurse, not an orderly. Technically, I'm a patient care support worker, which is a title that sounds more impressive than it is. I push the cart, I deliver the food, I pick up the empties. I've been doing it since I was 22, which means I've been doing it for 8 years, which is something I try not to think about too hard. That morning I was cutting through the East Corridor, the one that connects the older wing to the newer building, because it shaves about 40 seconds off my route, and I needed those 40 seconds. And there was a man standing in the middle of the hallway, very still, looking at a fire evacuation map on the wall like it had personally offended him. He was tall. That was the first thing I noticed. He was also wearing what I'd later find out was a hand-stitched charcoal coat that probably cost more than my monthly rent, which, for reference, is $1,900 for a one-bedroom in the North End. But I didn't know that yet. In that moment, he was just a man in a nice coat who was standing in the way of my cart. "Excuse me," I said. He turned. And I don't know how to explain this without sounding like I'm dramatizing it, but something about the way he turned, too slowly, too carefully, made me stop instead of pushing past him. His face was gray, not sick gray, emergency gray. "Are you okay?" I asked, which is a question I ask approximately 40 times a day, but I'd never meant it quite like that before. He opened his mouth, then he put one hand against the wall. I got to him before he went down, barely. I'm 5'4" and he had a solid 6 inches on me, and I do not have a background in catching falling men. But I got my shoulder under his arm and managed to sort of redirect the fall. We ended up sitting against the baseboard, his back against the wall. My cart stopped sideways in the middle of the hallway, and me half kneeling on the linoleum yelling for Cheryl at the nursing station around the corner. What happened after that was very fast, and also mostly not about me. Cheryl came, then 2 nurses, then a doctor I didn't recognize. The man, I didn't know his name yet, was helped to his feet with considerably more grace than I had managed, brought into a room, and the door closed. I stood in the corridor with my cart and my wet sock. My supervisor, Debbie, found me there about 4 minutes later. "What happened?" she asked. "A man almost fainted," I said. "I caught him. Sort of." She looked at my cart, then at me. "You okay?" "My sock is wet," I said. She didn't really have a response to that. Neither did I. I finished my tray run. I didn't think about the man in the gray coat again until he walked into the cafeteria 2 days later. I should say something about what the cafeteria is like at 7:30 in the morning, because it matters to the atmosphere of this story. It's not a nice cafeteria. The lighting is that particular fluorescent that makes everyone look vaguely unwell, which, given the venue, has a certain grim logic to it. The hot breakfast options are reconstituted scrambled eggs, 2 kinds of toast, and something that is technically oatmeal. The coffee is Tim Hortons, which is, look, it's Tim Hortons. I drink it every morning because it's there and it's caffeinated, and I've stopped having opinions about it. I was at my usual table, the one by the window that looks out onto the parking garage, which is less depressing than it sounds, because in March, the light is finally starting to come back, and sometimes the angle of the morning sun through the concrete slats is genuinely beautiful. I had my coffee. I had my phone. I was watching a video about someone's cat doing something with a paper bag. "Is this seat taken?" I looked up. It was him. He looked considerably better than the last time I'd seen him. The gray was gone from his face. He was clean-shaven in a way that suggested either a very good razor or someone who shaved him, which sounds like an odd detail to notice, but when you work in a hospital you notice things like that. He was still wearing a nice coat. Different coat, also expensive. "No," I said. "Go ahead," he sat. He had coffee, Tim Hortons, same as me, which I noted with some surprise, and nothing else. "You're the woman from the hallway," he said. I looked at him over my phone. "I am. You kept me from hitting my head on the floor. That's one way to describe it." He had a slight accent that I couldn't quite place. not heavy. Just a particular precision in the way he formed certain words, like they'd been learned in a classroom rather than picked up in conversation. I was told the impact at that angle could have been quite serious. "You were standing very close to the corner of the nursing station wall," I said. "It's a bad corner, someone's hit it before." He looked at me for a moment in a way that felt very direct, not rude, just assessing. "I'm Dominic," he said, and then, almost as an afterthought, "Hargreaves." I almost said the names on my list, which would have been a very strange thing to say to a stranger in a hospital cafeteria. "I'm June," I said instead. "Calloway. June," he repeated, like he was testing the weight of it. "Most people call me June," I added, unnecessarily. "Most people," he said. "Not all? My mother calls me Junebug," I said. "I'm not sure why I told you that." Something shifted in his expression. It wasn't quite a smile. It was the precursor to a smile, the moment just before someone decides whether to let themselves have it. He decided against it, but barely. "Thank you, June," he said. "For the hallway. Don't mention it." I meant it literally. My supervisor had already asked twice whether I'd filed an incident report, and I'd said yes, both times, which was only partially true. He drank his coffee. I watched my cat video. And somehow he was still there 20 minutes later, when I had to leave for my shift. And I have no real explanation for how that happened, except that we'd ended up talking. About the light through the parking garage. About the coffee. About whether the eggs in the cafeteria were actually eggs. And it hadn't felt like anything in particular. Just conversation. Easy, unhurried conversation, which is not the kind I usually have at 7:30 in the morning. "I'll probably be here a few more days," he said, when I stood to go. "People usually are," I said. He was there the next morning, and the one after that. I found out, across 4 days of 7:30 coffee, that he was in Halifax for work, which he described as asset management, which means different things to different people, and I didn't push it. I found out he was from Toronto originally, had lived in London for some years, had come back to Canada for various reasons that he didn't elaborate on. I found out he'd been standing in that hallway because he'd had a vasovagal syncope, a fancy name for a fainting episode, brought on by dehydration and a red-eye flight he shouldn't have been on. I found out he was 38, that he had no food allergies but didn't eat pork for reasons I won't go into, that he thought Tim Hortons coffee was genuinely bad but kept ordering it with an attitude of mild defiance he couldn't quite explain. He found out about the boots. He found out I'd been at the QEII for 8 years. He found out I had a younger brother in Moncton who called me every Sunday, and a cat named Biscuit who had been described by my vet as emotionally complex, which I thought was a generous framing. "Junebug," he said on the 4th morning, and I looked up from my phone. "Don't," I said. He looked unapologetic. "It suits you. My mother is the only one who... Your mother has good instincts." He said it with such complete seriousness that I couldn't even be annoyed. He took a sip of his bad coffee. "Do you always eat alone? At 7:30 in the morning?" "Yes, you could not be alone at 7:30 in the morning," he said, it was such a direct thing to say that I had to look at him for a moment to calibrate. "Are you asking me to have breakfast with you?" I asked. "Like on purpose? Outside of a hospital cafeteria?" "I'm asking if you'd like to have breakfast," he said. "The specifics are negotiable." I said yes. I didn't think too much about why. The restaurant he took me to was on Barrington Street, one of those places that had been in the same family for 30 years and still had the original wood paneling and a menu that hadn't changed much since 1994. Not a place you'd expect, given the coat, but he'd walked in like he knew exactly where he was going. The woman at the front had said, "Mr. Hargreaves, usual table?" And he'd said yes, and I'd followed him back to a booth by the window and tried not to look too closely at what any of this meant. "You come here often," I said. "When I'm in Halifax, how often is that?" He considered this, more recently. Over eggs and actual toast, I learned that the asset management description was not wrong exactly, but abbreviated. He owned things, properties primarily. He'd been in Halifax because of a development project on the waterfront, something to do with a building that had been sitting half-finished since before the pandemic. He was trying to decide whether to proceed with the original plan, demolish and rebuild, or pivot to a full restoration. "Which do you want to do?" I asked. "The restoration is more expensive by roughly $4 million, he said, "and considerably more complicated. That doesn't answer my question. He looked at me across the table. That look again, direct, assessing, but with something else in it now that I was starting to recognize. Like I'd said something that didn't fit the shape of the conversation he'd been expecting to have. The restoration, he said. I want to do the restoration. Then do it, I said. He said nothing for a moment. It's not that straightforward, he said. Most worthwhile things aren't, I said, and then felt immediately embarrassed because that sounded like something you'd put on a motivational poster, but he didn't treat it like that. He just nodded, slowly, like I'd confirmed something he'd been turning over for a while. After breakfast, he walked me back to the hospital. On Barrington in March, the wind comes off the harbor in a way that makes conversation difficult, so we walked mostly in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. At the entrance, he stopped. I'm in Halifax through next Friday, he said. Okay, I said. I'd like to do this again. Have breakfast? Have breakfast, he agreed. And other things if you're willing. I thought about it for exactly 1 second. I'm willing, I said. We went to the farmer's market on Saturday. We drove out to Peggy's Cove on Sunday, which was his idea, and the wind was brutal and the rocks were icy. And at one point he grabbed my arm because I'd slipped and didn't let go after I'd recovered my footing, and we stood there looking at the lighthouse for about 10 minutes without saying anything. It should have felt strange. It didn't. On Wednesday evening, he took me to dinner at a restaurant in the Seaport District, where the tasting menu was $185 per person. That's more than I make in a day, if you want to be precise about it. And I wore my good dress, and he wore a dark suit, and we sat across from each other with small, beautiful plates between us and talked until they started stacking chairs. You grew up here? He asked. Born at the QEI, actually, I said, which means I've technically worked at the place I was born, which is something my coworkers find funnier than I do. You like the work. It wasn't quite a question. Most days, I said. Some days I feel like I'm just moving trays. But then something happens and I remember why I stayed. Something like a man almost fainting in a corridor. Something like that, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I've been told I'm difficult to know. By whom? Several people over several years. He turned his wine glass slightly. They weren't wrong. You're not that difficult, I said. He looked at me. I haven't told you much about my work. The full scope of it. You've told me what matters, I said. The rest is logistics. The rest, he said carefully, is sometimes considerably more than logistics. There was something weighted in the way he said it. I noticed it. I chose not to pull on the thread right then, and I think, looking back, he was both grateful for that, and made more anxious by it, which is the particular torment of a person who has been waiting for the other shoe to drop for so long that they've started to distrust the absence of it. He left on Friday as he'd said he would. He texted me from the airport. Not a goodbye text, just a photo of a Tim Hortons cup with the message, even in Halifax departures, it's bad. I sent back, character building. He sent Junebug, which was, somehow, an entire conversation. He called that Sunday. He called the following Sunday. We talked for 2 hours both times, about nothing in particular. His project, my brother's new apartment in Moncton, what Biscuit had done to my left shoe. Not the one with the hole, a different shoe. What Halifax looked like in early April, when the snow finally stopped lying, and the city started to remember itself. In April, he came back. He didn't tell me he was coming. He texted when he was 20 minutes away, and I opened the door in my work clothes with my hair still damp, and he stood on my front step on Agricola Street with coffee. Actual good coffee, from a place on South Park, and said I was in the neighborhood, which was a lie and we both knew it. I let him in. I should say something about my apartment here, 'cause it's relevant. It's small. It's not the kind of place you'd expect a man in Dominic Hargreaves's position to be comfortable in. The couch is from Value Village. I have too many plants. There's a whole shelf dedicated to library books I've been meaning to return for 3 weeks. Biscuit eats on the kitchen counter because I don't have space for a bowl on the floor. He sat on my Value Village couch, and Biscuit walked directly across his lap, which Biscuit does not do with strangers, or really with anyone who isn't me. And he looked down at the cat with an expression of complete bafflement, and then reached down and scratched behind his ears, and Biscuit started purring loud enough to hear across the room. He doesn't do that, I said. What, sit on people? Trust people, I said. He looked up at me with that expression again, the one I'd started to catalog. Smart cat, he said. He was in Halifax for a week that time, and then 2 weeks the next month. And somewhere in there the project became a reason, rather than an explanation. He was in Halifax because of the building. He came to my apartment because of the building. He texted me photos of the architectural restoration plans at 11 at night because of the building. That's what I told myself. One evening in May, he was sitting at my kitchen table. He had started bringing his work there, which I'd allowed without either of us acknowledging what that meant. And I was making pasta, and Biscuit was doing his evening patrol of the windowsills. And he said, without looking up from his laptop, "I've had a conversation I should tell you about." "Okay," I said. I kept stirring. "The development group I work with. There's a proposal on the table, not just the waterfront building, a larger acquisition, a section of the North End." I stopped stirring. "The North End," I said. "Like, this North End?" "Several properties on Göttingen," he said. "The plan as originally drafted is residential conversion, high density. The current businesses would," he stopped, "would not be part of the new plan." I put the spoon down. "Göttingen Street it's not just a street. It's where my mother bought my school shoes. It's where the food bank is, which I used twice in my first year at the hospital, when I was 22, and my rent and my student loan payments and my grocery bill had a three-way argument I couldn't win. It's where Hamid runs his dry cleaning place that's been there since 1987, and where there's a Jamaican bakery that sells a coconut bread I have thought about at low moments." "Are you telling me this because of the business proposal?" I said carefully. "Or because of me?" He closed his laptop. "Both," he said. "I'm telling you both, which means you want my opinion. I want to know what you think," he said. "I want that separately from whether it affects anything I do." I sat down across from him. "I think," I said, "that there are a lot of ways to make money in Halifax right now. I think high-density condo conversion on Göttingen isn't one of the interesting ones. I think what you said about the waterfront building, doing the harder thing because it's the right thing, was the most honest thing I'd heard you say up to that point." I stopped. "And I think you already know what you want to do. You're asking me because you want someone to tell you it's okay to do it." He was quiet. "It's okay," I said. He looked at me across my kitchen table, Biscuit winding between his legs now, the pasta going slightly overdone on the stove, and something in his face changed in a way I hadn't seen before. Something that had been held very carefully for a very long time just let go. "I'm not a simple person," he said. "My work, the things I've done to get to where I am, not all of it looks the way this looks." He gestured vaguely at the kitchen at us. "I've cut corners. I've made decisions that I'm not proud of. I've worked with people I wouldn't work with now." "Are you warning me?" I asked. "I'm being honest with you," he said, possibly for the first time in a long time, with anyone. "I know," I said. "I could tell." I picked up the spoon again. "The pasta's overcooked." He laughed. It was not a polished sound. It was the laugh of someone who doesn't do it often enough and forgets, in the moment, to modulate it. I loved it immediately. "Stay for dinner?" I said. "Yes," he said without hesitation. There were things that came later that were harder. The meeting in June, I found out about through a friend who worked in city planning, who texted me a screenshot of a document that had Hargreaves Development Group across the top, and a proposal for the North End that looked considerably less thoughtful than what he'd described to me in my kitchen. Not evil, not illegal, but ambitious in ways that cost other people things. I sent him the screenshot, no message, just the image. He called within 3 minutes. "This isn't the current version," he said. "When was this version?" A pause. 3 weeks ago, before or after our conversation in my kitchen?" Silence. "After," he said. I sat with that for a moment. "So you told me what I wanted to hear," I said, and then went back to the original plan. "I had a board meeting," he said. "There was pressure." "I'm not asking about the board meeting," I said. "I'm asking about what you told me." He was quiet, and then, "Yes, I told you what I wanted to be true. I'm not sure those are the same thing." I looked at Biscuit, who was sitting on the windowsill watching the street below, with the serene indifference that I have always deeply envied in cats. "Come back to Halifax," I said. "June, not for the project," I said. "Come back and have this conversation in person, if you want to have it." Another silence, longer. "I want to have it," he said. He was on the first flight he could get. He showed up at my door on a Tuesday evening in June, and I let him in, and we sat on the couch. Biscuit immediately between us, which I suspected was the cat's editorial comment on the situation, and we talked for 3 hours. Not an argument, not entirely, more like a reckoning. One of those conversations where someone finally says the full version of things they've been saying in abbreviated form. And you hear it differently when it's all laid out. He talked about his father's company, about inheriting a set of practices alongside the business, and spending years deciding which ones he was willing to keep, and which ones were costing him something he couldn't name. About the board and the investors and the way a certain kind of business culture closes around you like water if you don't actively swim against it. I've been swimming against it for about 5 years, he said. I'm not always winning, but you're still swimming, I said. Yes. The Göttingen proposal, I said. The one from 3 weeks ago. Is it still on the table? Not in that form, he said. I pulled it. I looked at him. 2 days after I found out you'd seen it, he added. Which isn't. I know that's not the same as pulling it before. No, I said. It isn't. I know. He held my gaze. I'm telling you anyway. I looked at him for a long time. At his face, which I'd come to know well enough to read. The particular set of his jaw when he was being careful with his words. The way his eyes changed when he was being honest versus when he was managing a conversation. This was honest. Okay, I said. He exhaled. I'm not saying it's fine, I said. I'm saying okay, which is different. I know the difference, he said. Biscuit chose this moment to stand up, turn in a circle, and then sit directly on Dominic's leg, kneading his very expensive trousers with absolutely zero regard for the cost of them. Dominic looked down. I looked at Biscuit. He does that when he trusts someone, I said. I know, he said. You told me. You remembered. I remember most things you tell me, he said. And then quieter, Junebug, I don't know who moved first. I suspect Biscuit had some role in it, structurally. But at some point I was leaning against his shoulder on my Value Village couch, and his hand was in my hair and outside on Agricola Street. The June evening was doing that thing it does in Halifax, where the light stretches gold and long past 9 o'clock. And everything was not resolved, not entirely, not yet, but it was real, it was honest, and it was mine. He stayed for the weekend. He came back the weekend after. In August, he told me he'd decided to base the Halifax operation out of Halifax, rather than commuting from Toronto. He said it with the particular kind of careful casualness that I recognized as Dominic speak for something that matters a great deal to him. That's a big decision, I said. Yes, he said. What made you decide? He looked at me across my kitchen table, where he had by this point accumulated a permanent coffee mug, half a charger cable, and an inexplicable spare pair of socks. You know what made me decide, he said. I want to hear you say it, I said. He set down his coffee. You, he said. Halifax is where you are. And Halifax is, he paused, Halifax is where I want to be. I thought about March, about the hole in my boot and the slush on Göttingen, and a man standing very still in a corridor, looking gray in a way that made me stop instead of push past. You would have been fine, I said. You know that, right? If I hadn't been there, you would have just hit the floor and been fine. Probably, he agreed. So it was just a coincidence, I said. He looked at me for a moment. I don't think it was, he said simply. I didn't argue with him. I had stopped arguing with things that turned out to be true. Outside, the harbor was doing something beautiful with the late August light, the way it only does in Halifax, the way I've watched it do my whole life from different windows. I'd stopped seeing it for a while, the way you stop seeing things you've always had. But lately I'd started noticing again. I think that's his doing too. Some things you don't plan for. You're just running late, and your boot has a hole in it, and someone is standing in the wrong place at the right time, and everything shifts. I wouldn't change the hole in the boot, not for anything.